It's special to be standing up here on this stage this morning because 15 years ago, I was sitting where you're sitting, or I was sometimes standing on the old red stage, spent a lot of hours rehearsing with the worship team on that stage with Jed and Seth, and spent hundreds of hours playing indoor soccer in the fellowship hall, breaking a few windows along the way. And so when we made that turn that first night to come here, you know, that turn that I used to make so many times, I got goosebumps because it felt like, in a certain way, coming home. And so as I was preparing this message, I teach at the Portuguese Bible Institute, I teach Greek, I teach New Testament, so I just kind of assumed, okay, I'll do something from the New Testament. And God really put on my heart, God kept bringing me back to the book of Ruth. And I went, God, missions in the book of Ruth, I don't get it. And what I really felt was share with people. Don't ask if anyone who's going to be there that morning is going into missions. Assume that they are. And tell them how to do that. Because the reality is all of us are called to missions. Some of us are called to go to another country and to another culture. But missions is not only for missionaries. The Great Commission is for all of us. And so it comes down to decisions. So decisions is the key word that I want to talk about this morning. And that's why. So this is Lisbon. This is what we call the Rotunda de Marquês de Pombal. When I was living in the area, they installed the roundabout on Clearwater Beach. And everybody hated it. They should get a look at this. This is two roundabouts in one. Because you have an inside roundabout and there's an outside roundabout. And both the inside and outside roundabouts have traffic lights, and there's about 6 or 8 lanes involved in total. I don't drive here. If we have to go here, my wife drives. Because she's much better at those decision-making processes than I am. So if you're driving in this complicated roundabout, you need to pay attention to the situation, right? Where are the other cars? Do I need to be moving inside because I'm not going to be taking the next exit? But you need to have perception of that situation, right? If there's a car in the lane next to me, it doesn't do me much good if I don't realize that car is in the lane next to me, and that should then influence my decision. This is really how we live our lives. Situation, perception, decision. Believer, non-believer, but our role as believers is making sure that God and his values are informing our perception, our decision, because that's going to alter the situation that we're going to then have to deal with afterwards. And so this morning, we're going to look at the first couple of verses of the book of Ruth. We're going to see exactly this dynamic. It's a different culture. It's a different context. But we're going to grab some principles that are in that text and that are applicable to our context. Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges were judging, there was a famine in the land. This is our situation. So we have the judges are judging. There's no king. There's not a centralized leadership. When God needed to deliver the people, God raised up a person for that situation. But it was a little bit of a chaotic time. And now we have our decision. And a man from Bethlehem of Judah departed to sojourn as a foreigner in the fields of Moab. He, his wife, and his 2 sons. So we have situation, we have decision. Now what the text doesn't explicitly tell us is, well, what was their perception of the situation? However, there's some implicit things here, particularly if you were to speak Hebrew, that will clue you in a little bit about what their perception of the situation was. For example, where are they from? They're from a place that in Hebrew Bethlehem, we're familiar, okay, that's where Jesus was born, but it means something. Bethlehem means house of bread. So that's, and it was given that name, it's a place with a lot of agricultural production, but there's another word in the text that conflicts with the meaning of the place where they live. In Bethlehem, house of bread, there was ra'av, there was famine. Those two things don't go together. This is supposed to be the place where there's an abundance of food, and there is no food. Verse 2 gives us some more details. And this man was named Elimelech, and his wife was named Naomi, and his two sons were named Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites from Bethlehem of Judah. This man's name has a meaning. And his name literally means, so Elimelech means, my God is king. What was the decision that he just made? He just made the decision to leave behind the mechanisms that God set up within Israel to submit to the authority of a foreign king. The word gur means to sojourn as a foreigner, to leave your country, to submit to the political system of another country. Something that I did when I moved to Portugal. I didn't move over as a missionary. I moved over as an immigrant. I taught English. I had to figure out, how do I pay taxes in this other country, and Social Security, and how do I get a residence visa? It's not easy to be a foreigner in somebody else's country. And that was the decision that this family made, and that meant moving outside of the covenant system that God had put in place in Israel at that moment in time. So his name means, my God is king, but he's willing to call somebody else king. So there's all of these little details scattered throughout the text. So our situation, we have famine instead of plenty. They are willing to abandon the promised land. And so I think the implicit perception, at least for this family, is we need to solve this problem. God is not doing anything. Because what do we not see them do in the text? We don't see Elimelech go and, okay, is there a prophet? Can I talk to the priest? Can we look at the law? Is there something that we're not doing? Why is God, who is the bringer of the rain, the bringer of plenty, why are we dealing with famine? And in fact, just a couple of verses later, when food comes, it actually says, and the Lord visited his people, and there was bread. So there being no bread is a sign that something somewhere isn't right. And rather than trying to figure out what's not right, Elimelech comes up with his own solution. And we see lots of people throughout the scriptures do this. Abraham had some creative ideas. They didn't always go so well. Moses had some creative ideas. Sometimes they didn't work out. Elimelech has his own creative solution to the problem. Now, I'd like to sort of jump for a second to the situation that we have in Portugal. Missions is contextual, right? The problems that we face in Portugal are different than the problems that somebody in Papua New Guinea is going to face, or the problems that somebody's going to deal with in Africa. So this is Portugal, a country of 10 million people. Got the Azores in the Atlantic, where Mani da Cunha has been active. There's also a couple of islands, Madeira, and then we have mainland Portugal. So right next to Spain. Mainland Portugal would fit inside the state of Florida. 10 million people. However, those 10 million people, so we're hearing this morning in Sunday school, to be Jewish is culturally, it means you don't believe in him. I don't even want to say Jesus' name. And in the Portuguese mindset, the Portuguese culture, to be Portuguese is to be Catholic. And so when anybody else comes in, they go, well, you're that because you grew up somewhere else. So you go be that, and I'll be Catholic, and leave me alone. And it's something that we're having a lot of Brazilian immigrants come over right now. And it's something that the church in Portugal are having to sort of coach lovingly our Brazilian brothers and sisters because they present an opportunity, right? They've got energy and joy and they want to share the gospel. But oftentimes like, well, let's do it this way because that's what works in Brazil. And we kind of have to put our arm around them and go, but we're not in Brazil. This is a different context. And what works there may not work here. And for the average Portuguese person, if I want something from God, I don't ask God. Why would I do that? What I should do is I should ask Mary. And in fact, I'm going to bargain with Mary. I'll make promises. Mary, if you give me this, then I'll do this and this and this and this and this. And then, because God likes Mary much more than he likes me, then she'll go and she'll ask God, and then I'll get what I want. And then I'll go keep my promise. So in this photograph, this is the Santuário de Nossa Senhora de Fátima. This is one of the largest Marian pilgrimage sites in the world. Millions of people come to this place in May of every year, many of them walking. Some of them will even walk kilometers on their knees and show up with bloody knees at the end because they think this means God will give me what I want. This is our context. Then in the cities, we've got a lot of growing secularism and materialism. You've got people who go, there is no God. Oh, you believe in a God, how quaint. This is our context. However, there's also global opportunity. So because of the 15th century, colonialism, global expansion, Portuguese is spoken by 250 million people on 4 continents. All the places highlighted in blue on this map speak our language. And Portugal continues to have generally positive diplomatic relationships with these countries. So, that's our situation. We want to share just briefly our decisions. We sum it up in one phrase. We're involved in equipping leaders and building bridges to relational evangelism in Portugal and Lusophone Africa. Lusophone meaning countries in Africa that speak Portuguese. How do we do that? One of the ways we do that, I'm involved at the Portuguese Bible Institute and its mission statement, which has been unchanged for 50 years, to equip, in collaboration with churches, servants of God, to effectively exercise and multiply their ministries for the extension of the kingdom. So that's what we do. A church identifies somebody who they think, okay, this young person might have some leadership potential, but they need some training. They need tools. They need to know how to be effective in this context. So they'll send them to us. And we'll train them, but we'll continue to keep that link with the local church because we want them to go back there and be effective there and to represent a next generation of leadership there. In fact, that bottom photo, that's graduation from this past year. There's 3 of our leaders in the photo, and there's 3 graduates in that photo. All 3 of those young men are currently either pastoring churches or in internships to join the pastoral teams at Portuguese churches. We've been doing it for 50 years. 1974 was a big year in Portugal. In fact, you couldn't have an evangelical seminary in Portugal before 1974. There was a fascist dictatorship in place. Came into power at the same time Hitler and Mussolini came into power in Germany and Italy, but because Portugal wasn't involved in World War II, that regime stayed in place. And it stayed in place up to 1974. In fact, one of the founders of the Bible Institute, about a year earlier, had a conversation with the secret police, where they basically rocked up to the Bible Institute and said, hey, we know who you are. We know what you're doing. I'm assuming that from this conversation you know who we are, and you need to relax a little bit. You're making too much noise. And if you keep making noise, the next conversation will not be quite so civilized. There was political change in 74, but in Portugal, a law that guarantees religious liberty, something that in this country was like, we have the Constitution, we have religious liberty. The year 2000. And the law does not apply to the Catholic Church. When the law was drafted, it was drafted, and then right at the end of the process, this article suddenly appeared in the law and it got ratified. And the article basically says, well, this law applies to everybody else because they got grandfathered in. That's our context. So, what are we doing to equip these leaders? We're an interdenominational school. There's a lot of denominational diversity in Portugal. There are not a lot of Bible schools. So we've said, look, if you come from a church that, is minimally biblical, you're not like preaching some weird cult doctrine. If it's a mainline evangelical church, you are welcome to study here. And we find that it actually enriches our students. They're in class and, okay, well, I think this about baptism. Well, I think this about baptism. Okay, well, rather than arguing about it, why don't we learn how to dialogue? Why don't we practice critical thinking? Why don't we, without you having to, because if you're going to go pastor in a Baptist church and you're going to go pastor in a Presbyterian church, those are different contexts. But how do we focus on the fact that we're on the same team and that we live in a country where 2 to 3% of the population believes in Jesus, and of that 2 to 3%, more than half of those came to know Jesus in another country and then moved here? How do we focus on making an impact rather than focusing on our energy on arguing with one another? Every student who is going to go into ministry is given a professor mentor. And so one of the things that's part of our curriculum is, okay, in your church, you need to talk to the leadership, and we want you to have a ministry project. Not what we tell you to do, but what your church needs or what your ministry needs. And then you bring us that plan, and we'll mentor you through it. We'll talk about what went well, what could have gone better, so that when you get into the real life of ministry, you've already got some mileage. You've already been over a bump or two in the road, but you had that mentor there. And what we find is that even when students leave the school, they run into something that's a little bit of bigger bump on the road than they thought. The first phone call they usually make is to that professor mentor. And so they have that support structure. One of the big changes since the last time I visited you, this little thing, I visited you in 2020 last, this little thing called COVID was on the horizon. And it forced us to go online. And it's turned out to be an enormous blessing. Because now students don't have to come to Lisbon to get trained. If a student has a decent enough internet connection in the place where they live, whether that be in Europe or whether they're a Portuguese-speaking immigrant in another European country or whether they're in Portuguese-speaking Africa, they have access to that equipping that they need. This is Bibiano. Bibiano lives in Huambo, Angola. He's a university professor there. It's a university town. Sort of like Gainesville is here in Florida. If it wasn't for the University of Florida, Gainesville probably wouldn't be terribly significant. Huambo probably wouldn't be terribly significant in Angola if it wasn't for the university that's there. He's also a leader of something like InterVarsity or Campus Crusade, the equivalent of that on that college campus. Lord willing, next summer of 2025, he will become the first graduate of the Portuguese Bible Institute to have completed 100% of his training in Africa. He has never been to Lisbon. I'm his professor mentor, but we'll Zoom call about every 2 weeks. Okay, Bibiana, what did you do over the last 2 weeks? How did it go? What can we learn from that? And God is doing really, really cool things in Angola. Bibiana is part of that. And we get the privilege to be part of that because God has allowed us with technology, and we're really hoping. Our biggest limitation in Africa is the quality of internet. If we could get, Starlink consistently, it would be a dream. So something to pray for. If we can get high-quality internet in Africa. We have the curriculum, we have the structure, we know how to do it. We just need to be able to connect to those. And we have students who contact us all the time, and we try. Okay, let's do a test, and we'll log on, we'll start class, and 15 minutes in, beep, they disappear. So something to pray about. If we can get good internet, then there are some amazing, amazing things that could be done. So that's primarily what I do. This is not the Golden Gate Bridge, by the way. This is in Lisbon. And actually, you don't see it in this photo because it was taken from the top. There's a statue of Jesus standing there like this. I don't think they have one of those in San Francisco. So this is the bridge so you're looking at Lisbon from the other side of the river. This is Almada. And building bridges is what my wife does. She started in 2017 a ministry called VAI. And VAI in Portuguese means go. But it's also an acronym. So what we do is we use trips, or viagens in Portuguese, camping, acampamentos in Portuguese, and partnerships, or intercâmbios in Portuguese, to bring believers and non-believers together to build bridges to evangelism. This is the mission statement that she came up with. VAI exists to bring diverse people together. Doesn't matter what age you are. Doesn't matter what nationality you are. Through excursions, trips, camping, and partnerships that contribute to an environment of friendship and promote the initiatives of the kingdom of God. And the idea is always we've got believers and non-believers participating together. Because the idea is that the non-believers will notice a difference. They'll go, oh, that's different. Why do you do that way? Oh, because I'm a believer. You're an evangelical? Oh, but you're so normal. And that's exactly the reaction that we want. Because in Portugal, to evangelize, there's a lot of barriers that you have to get past first. If you're to walk up to somebody on the streets of Portugal, can I share with you No. That's just our context. That's our reality. So, her goals: facilitate new experiences, foster a contagious atmosphere, enjoy fellowship and sharing. Oftentimes, when we take a trip, we'll, rent a little Airbnb or a youth hostel so that, we're cooking meals together. We're, sharing sleeping spaces. We're doing life. And there's more and more opportunities when you do it that way for people to notice that there's something different and to ask about it. Make and deepen authentic friendships, create long-lasting memories, participate in strategic causes, one of which is to introduce the gospel. She started in May of 2017, so in May of this year, it will have been 7 years that she's been doing this. She's organized more than 130 activities. By the way, she works full-time. Most days she wakes up at 5 in the morning to put a couple of hours of planning for this ministry in before she goes to work, because she knows that after a day at the office, she's in no mood to, be looking at the computer and searching for flights. And more than 230 people have participated. In this photo, my dad's actually in there somewhere. Those of you who know him, you can find him. Where's Waldo? So this is a group that we took to the north of Portugal. There's a suspension bridge. Sylvia's boss is in this photo. It was an activity that they heard about, and the family wanted to come along. And so we've had the opportunity to build a relationship with them and to talk about life and death and eternity. And we've had some really cool conversations. Another thing that we did last year was we went backpacking down the coast. So there's a trail that follows the Atlantic coast, cliffs and beaches. And one of the young ladies on this trip, she found out I was teaching at the Bible Institute, and we had about a 2-hour conversation. She came up to me and goes, well, I'm going to ask you a question. You don't have to answer it, but, I'm really curious about the biblical view on homosexuality. Because, they never start with the easy questions, right? And so we talked for 2 hours, and she was coming from a very different perspective on the issue. But to her, the idea of the scriptures to us is sacred. That's God telling human beings, this was how I made you. And so when you're involved in these kind of behaviors, that's not what I made you to do. And it was kind of a strange thing for her. But you could see the wheels turning in her head. And that's how evangelism is done in Portugal. Most of the people that I've met who've come to Christ from non-believing families, it's about a 2-year process of asking questions. And usually they start with the hard ones. That's why we need to be equipping leaders. And answering those. And they'll think about it. And they'll come back with another question. And we'll answer it. And they'll think about it. And so what Sylvia does is she builds bridges so that those questions can happen, so that those relationships can be built, and so that that dialogue can take place. So those are our decisions. Let's get back to Elimelech and his family. And this man named Elimelech and his wife was named, okay, so we've got their names, we've got their decision. They went into the fields or country of Moab, and they stayed there. And there's actually a word play here. The word fields or country here indicates that they've got a decision to make. They can't have both. And the word is actually written, well, it's not misspelled, but it's written differently than it's usually written in the Hebrew Bible. And it's a word play. Because these 3 letters in Hebrew can actually make 2 different words. So what's in the text in Ruth is this word, Sade Moav, which means the fields or country of Moab. But usually this word is written with a different letter at the end. And they've changed the spelling of the word just slightly. So it would usually be Sadeh. And they've written in Ruth, Sadai. Because if you change the placement of those little dots, and the Jews didn't write with those dots at that point in time, that was something that then came about afterwards, and the academics use it to kind of distinguish between words. Those same 3 letters are the word Shaddai, often a shortened version of El Shaddai. One of the most common Hebrew names, or a common Hebrew name for God, because in the Old Testament, God has different names that different authors will use in different moments, Adonai and Shaddai and Elohim. So there's a word play here. This family can choose Sadeh or Shaddai, but they can't have both. So what's their choice? Our choice is the fields of Moab. And unfortunately, it's not a great decision. And Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Now we have a new situation. So that decision has now created a new situation. These married Moabite women. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. So now we have new decisions. And these are decisions that could eventually lead to this family losing their identity. Well, we've got, Israelites and Moabites married. Well, what are the kids going to do? What are the grandkids going to believe in? So we have decisions, new situations, more decisions, and things really aren't looking great for this family at this moment. And then things get worse. Both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman, referring to Naomi, was left without her 2 sons and her husband. We've gone from bad to worse. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the fields or country of Moab. And again, the word is written that same way. That's not the normal way to write the word. So she's got another decision, for she heard in the fields or country of Moab, the Lord had visited his people and given them bread. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So Naomi, who's now without the men in her family, which is a very, very vulnerable situation in that context, is going from the Sadeh of Moab back to Judah, back toward Shaddai. And the rest of the book then explains the process of redemption and restoration that God takes the family through. So even though there were some maybe not great decisions, God's mercy triumphs in the life of that family. So, how does this tie into missions? We just saw situation, perception, decision. We saw a couple of rounds of that in this family. And the big decision that they were constantly making was, are we going to include God and his values in the decisions that we're making or not? And I think the question for us is, where does God's mission factor into our situation, our perception of it, and the decisions that we make? In your own situation and in the global situation, we are every day, every week, every month, every year presented with options. And in our own way, we have Sadeh and Shaddai. Are we going to be me-focused? Elimelech's family wasn't the only family affected by the famine. We don't see that he goes, you know what? Why don't we as a community try to find out what's going on and solve this? Nope. Me and my family are getting out of town. The rest of you are on your own. And this was one of the big things that my eyes have been open to in the last 14 years since I left the United States and interacted with other cultures. We are toxically me-focused. Just listening to the news growing up, I remember the news being about, okay, this thing happened in this place and happened in that place. I haven't heard any news that dealt with anything other than the political situation in this country since I got here. There's a whole other world out there. And if we let ourselves get sucked into that, our world shrinks. Missions is really hard to do when our worldview is like this. So, my challenge to you would be, as much as you can, run from that me focus. Look at the kingdom. Learn about other countries. What is their situation? How can you pray for them? If you find a situation that tugs on your heart, maybe start thinking and planning about taking a short-term trip there. Short-term missions trips were what I never imagined that I would be doing what I'm doing now. That was never part of my life plan. It was really cool yesterday morning to see the video from Brody and Jenny Pav. One of the photos that they used in their video was a missions trip in 2008 to Guatemala that my parents organized. I don't think any of us would have imagined when we went on that trip that there were 2 future career missionaries from this church on that trip, but there were. And my road to missions wasn't one big moment. It was lots of God's fingerprints. And sometimes those fingerprints were really frustrating. I had a plan for my life when I graduated college. I went to college in St. Augustine. I loved it there. I was dating a girl. I thought we were going to get married. I had it figured out. And then God tanked it in 6 months. And that's when I ended up at Suncoast. And it was 2 years here of God growing faith muscles, of me going, God, what next? And God going, wait, Because I need to work on you before I send you to where you need to go. That wasn't what I wanted to hear at that moment, but God knew best. And one of the few things that I did right at that point was I didn't get so drawn into me that I just grabbed onto any old thing and ran with it. I did my best, and I was far from perfect and still am far from perfect, to keep my focus on the kingdom. And that's my challenge to you. The family chose short-term security. But in the medium to long term, they ended up choosing disaster. And again, sometimes in our culture, I want it now gets prioritized instead of prayerful discernment. When we got on the plane to come here, the kid in the seat in front of me was watching reels, which are already short videos. I think he spent an average of 1.5 seconds on each video. I mean, the video would start, it wouldn't be entertaining enough, next. That's how short-term our culture is moving. Prayerful discernment is a discipline. That's not a word we like very much, but it's important. Sadeh represented taking the easy way out. If you want to take the easy way out, missions probably isn't for you. Sometimes there's sacrifice involved. Sometimes you need to persist. Sometimes the pressure is going to tell you to do exactly what you know you shouldn't do. Sometimes it means choosing not just not bitter persistence, joyful persistence. Spent a lot of time in the last 2 years studying the book of James, and one of the words in Greek that James uses over and over, hupomone, often in the context of joyful persistence, when things are hard. And it was that time, those years that I spent with things being hard and God going, wait, and me going, no, I want to know what to do, that gave me that basic ability to be joyfully persistent, and it served me well in the mission field. So my challenge to you, because I believe that all of us are called to missions, and I believe that there are probably, particularly among maybe some of the young people here, future missionaries in this room. Invest in learning joyful persistence. Invest in learning prayerful discernment. Cultivate a kingdom focus. Make missions a priority. And I've had some cool conversations this week, and I'm willing to put my time where my mouth is. We're really well set up in Portugal to host short-term teams. You don't need a visa. You can drink the water. You don't need any vaccinations. You can flush toilet paper in the toilet. We have hospitals, and they're actually really good. In case, just in case, it's good to have that safety net. The food is really good. If you feel God tugging on your heart, send me an email. I was talking to Jed this week. What if you brought a couple of the college students over? If you feel God tugging on your heart, send me an email. Because short-term trips were a huge part of what God did in my life to put me where I am doing what I'm doing now. And if I can help be part of your journey, that would be a privilege, and I'm here for it. So my encouragement to all of you, whether you stay, whether you go, all of us can be part of making missions a priority. Not Sadeh, Shaddai, and the glory of his name.